What if the person you entrust with your life turns out to be your executioner? Doctors take an oath to do no harm. But today, we'll tell you about those who turned their knowledge into a weapon. Michael Mastromarino was not a physician, but a dentist and entrepreneur who saw a lucrative opportunity in the world of human tissue transplantation. He founded a company called Biomedical Tissue Services, which on the surface appeared to be a legitimate enterprise supplying bone, skin, and tendons for life-saving surgeries. The reality was a macabre operation that resembled the work of grave robbers. Mastromarino and his associates illegally harvested body parts from corpses at funeral homes across New York and Pennsylvania without any consent from the deceased's families. To bypass regulations, they forged death certificates and medical histories, claiming the bodies were younger and healthier than they were. This meant they were harvesting tissue from individuals who had died from cancer, sepsis, and other diseases, and then selling this potentially contaminated material to hospitals. Thousands of unsuspecting patients received these illicitly harvested tissues, putting them at risk of infection and disease. It was a scheme of ghoulish greed, a body-snatching ring that treated the human body as a raw commodity. A prosecutor described it as something out of a cheap horror movie. In 2008, Mastromarino pleaded guilty to enterprise corruption, theft, and reckless endangerment, receiving a sentence of up to 54 years in prison. He died in custody in 2013. His crimes were a horrifying perversion of the gift of donation, turning an act of generosity into a source of criminal profit. When the dead are not allowed to rest in peace and their bodies are desecrated for profit, what trust can the living have in the systems meant to honor them? Dr. Farid Fatah, a prominent oncologist in Michigan, built an empire on a foundation of hope. He was known for his aggressive treatment style and a comforting bedside manner that reassured thousands of cancer patients they were in the best possible hands. His waiting rooms were full, his reputation sterling. He was, to many, the last line of defense against a terrifying disease. This image, however, was a meticulously crafted lie. The shocking truth was that Fatah was a monster, motivated by pure, unadulterated greed. He intentionally misdiagnosed healthy individuals with cancer, condemning them to rounds of excruciating, unnecessary chemotherapy, simply to bill insurance companies for millions of dollars. He gave potent, life-altering drugs to people who had no illness, poisoning them for profit. He administered excessive treatments to those who were truly sick, prolonging their suffering to maximize his income. This was not a medical error. It was a cold-blooded business model built on human agony. At his 2015 sentencing, one victim described the experience as being tortured by a man she once revered. Fatah's scheme, which involved over 550 victims and more than $17 million in fraudulent claims, was one of the most egregious cases of healthcare fraud in American history. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison. His actions were a profound betrayal, a corruption so deep it weaponized the very concept of care. When the cure itself is the poison, administered by a hand you trust, where does a person turn for healing? David Kwiatkowski was not a doctor, but as a traveling medical technician, he was a vital part of the healthcare machinery, trusted to handle sterile equipment and assist in critical procedures. For years, he moved from hospital to hospital across multiple states, a ghost in the system, carrying a dark secret and a deadly virus. Kwiatkowski was a drug addict, and his addiction led to an act of staggering selfishness and recklessness. He would steal syringes filled with the powerful painkiller fentanyl, inject himself, and then refill the used syringes with saline to hide his theft. He would then place these contaminated needles back into circulation for patient use. His blood was infected with hepatitis C, and with every dirty needle he returned, he played Russian roulette with an unsuspecting patient's life. His actions in 19 hospitals across 7 states created a public health crisis, leading to at least 45 people being infected with the same strain of the virus he carried. It was a biological attack born of addiction and a complete disregard for human life. The investigation to trace the outbreak was one of the largest in the history of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. When finally caught, a prosecutor called his actions cruel and evil. In 2013, Kwiatkowski was sentenced to 39 years in federal prison for fraud and obtaining controlled substances. His case exposed terrifying vulnerabilities in hospital oversight and the devastating ripple effect of one person's addiction. When the tools of medicine are contaminated at the source, how can any patient feel truly safe? Earl Bradley was a pediatrician in the small state of Delaware, a man to whom thousands of families entrusted their most precious gift: their children. For over a decade, he was a beloved figure, known for his gentle demeanor and his seemingly dedicated practice in the town of Lewis. He was a pillar of the community, a trusted doctor in a place where everyone knew everyone. This trust was the key that unlocked a secret world of unimaginable horror. Behind the closed door of his examination room, Bradley was a prolific and monstrous predator. He used his medical authority as a shield to commit unspeakable acts of sexual abuse against more than 100 of his child patients, many of whom were infants and toddlers. His betrayal was systematic and chillingly documented. He recorded his crimes on video, creating a secret library of his own depravity. His actions represented one of the most horrific and extensive cases of medical abuse in American history. The discovery of his crimes in 2009 sent shockwaves of grief and rage through the tight-knit community, shattering the illusion of safety and leaving hundreds of families to grapple with a lifetime of trauma. In 2011, he was convicted on 24 counts of rape, assault, and other charges, receiving a sentence of 14 life terms plus 165 years. His clinic, once a place of healing, became a monument to a predator's cold-blooded calculation. How can a community ever heal when the one sworn to protect its children was the very source of their deepest wounds? Dr. Richard Paulus was a highly successful cardiologist in Kentucky, a man whose expertise was sought by patients with serious heart conditions. He built a lucrative practice by performing a common procedure, the insertion of heart stents to open clogged arteries. To his patients, he was a lifesaver, a skilled surgeon literally mending their broken hearts. But a chilling pattern began to emerge. Paulus was performing an unusually high number of these procedures, and an investigation revealed the horrifying truth. Many of them were completely unnecessary. Driven by greed, he falsified patient records, exaggerating the severity of their conditions to justify invasive and risky surgeries. He subjected hundreds of people to the trauma and potential complications of a major heart operation they did not need, all to defraud Medicare and private insurers out of millions of dollars. He turned his patients' trust into his personal ATM. This was a betrayal that went beyond financial fraud. It was a physical violation, risking lives for profit. The U.S. attorney for the case stated that Paulus preyed on the trust of his patients. In 2016, he was convicted of healthcare fraud and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The case left a legacy of fear and mistrust among his former patients, many of whom were left to wonder if the scars on their chests were symbols of healing or marks of a con man. If you cannot trust a doctor's diagnosis of your own heart, what part of the medical pact remains sacred? Dr. Anna Pu was a respected surgeon at New Orleans Memorial Medical Center, a place that became an island of desperation when Hurricane Katrina plunged the city into chaos in 2005. With the power cut, floodwaters rising, and temperatures soaring, the hospital became a scene from a nightmare. There was no sanitation, no way to evacuate the sickest patients, and dwindling supplies. In this crucible of crisis, Dr. Pu and 2 nurses made decisions that would haunt them forever. They administered morphine and other drugs to a number of critically ill patients, allegedly to ease their suffering in what they believed were their final moments, with no hope of rescue. But after the storm, accusations emerged that these were not acts of mercy, but of euthanasia, that they had intentionally delivered lethal overdoses. The case ignited a firestorm of ethical debate. Was this a compassionate response to an impossible situation? Or was it murder? Pooh was arrested and accused of second-degree murder, her face splashed across national news. She maintained her innocence, stating passionately, "I am not a murderer." The community was fiercely divided. Many saw her as a hero who stayed behind in apocalyptic conditions, while others saw a doctor who crossed the ultimate ethical line. In 2007, a grand jury refused to indict her on the murder charges, and the case was dropped. She was never convicted of a crime, but the controversy left an indelible mark on her life and raised profound questions for the medical profession. In a moment of absolute societal collapse, where does the duty to provide comfort end and the act of taking a life begin? Conrad Murray was a cardiologist whose career took a fateful turn when he became the personal physician to one of the most famous men in the world, Michael Jackson. This position came with immense pressure and a lucrative salary, placing Murray in an insular world of celebrity and immense expectation. The public saw a doctor entrusted with the health of a global icon, a gatekeeper to his well-being. But in the private confines of Jackson's mansion, the lines of medical ethics blurred into a dangerous gray. Jackson suffered from chronic insomnia, and Murray began administering the powerful surgical anesthetic propofol as a sleep aid, a shockingly reckless act far outside any accepted medical standard, especially within a private residence lacking emergency equipment. This was not treatment. It was a deadly gamble. On that tragic day in June of 2009, Murray's gamble failed. He administered a fatal dose of the drug, and then, crucially, delayed calling for help, and failed to inform paramedics about the propofol. It was a catastrophic failure of judgment, born from a desire to please his high-profile patient and maintain his privileged position. During his 2011 trial for involuntary manslaughter, the prosecution argued Murray's actions constituted a complete abandonment of his patient. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in jail, ultimately serving nearly 2. The case sparked a global conversation about the responsibilities of physicians to powerful patients and the corrupting influence of fame and money. When a doctor's duty to preserve life clashes with the desire to enable a patient's demands, who is ultimately responsible for the final, fatal outcome? Christopher Duntsch, a charismatic and supremely confident neurosurgeon in Dallas, Texas, was a man who projected an aura of brilliance. Patients were drawn to his promises of fixing their debilitating pain, seeing him as a miracle worker in a field of complex medicine. He moved through the sterile halls of surgical centers with an unnerving self-assurance, a confidence that masked a terrifying abyss of incompetence and malice. But behind the closed doors of the operating room, a shadow consumed the light. A scalpel in his hands was not an instrument of healing. It was a weapon of ruin. In a horrifyingly short period, he botched 33 out of 38 surgeries, leaving a trail of maimed, paralyzed, and deceased patients. His colleagues watched in disbelief, noting he operated with a shocking disregard for standard procedure, often seeming disoriented and volatile. Investigations later revealed he was frequently under the influence of narcotics, his surgical decisions guided by a lethal combination of ego and impairment. His actions were not just accidents, they were a pattern of destruction. The Texas Medical Board was criticized for its slow response, allowing Duntsch to move from one hospital to another, his trail of devastation growing with each new credential. During his 2017 trial, the prosecution presented the shocking turn. This wasn't just malpractice, it was assault. One prosecutor stated, We are not talking about a doctor who made a mistake. We are talking about a doctor who did things intentionally. He was sentenced to life in prison, a rare verdict for a physician. The case left a permanent scar on the community, a chilling reminder of systemic failures, and a man who twisted his sacred duty into a personal theater of horror. When does a healer's dangerous God complex finally become society's monster? Michael Swango was the all-American boy, a handsome and decorated ex-Marine who seemed destined for a distinguished career in medicine. Colleagues at Ohio State University's medical school noted his intelligence and charm, but also a peculiar fascination with gruesome accidents and violent death. This was a darkness that festered just beneath the surface, a chilling premonition of the terror to come. Swango's journey as a physician became a nomadic hunt across the United States and eventually to Zimbabwe, leaving a quiet, lethal trail in his wake. His weapon of choice was poison, often arsenic or other potent chemicals, administered with the cold precision of a predator. He would inject toxins into his patients' IV drips or contaminate the food and coffee of his unsuspecting colleagues, watching their sudden, agonizing declines with a detached curiosity. For years, his actions went undetected, dismissed as unexplained medical events or tragic coincidences. How could anyone suspect the friendly, dedicated doctor? That was his camouflage. The true scale of his crimes is staggering, with estimates suggesting he may have murdered as many as 60 people. It was a betrayal of trust on an almost unimaginable scale. In 2000, facing overwhelming evidence, Swango pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and 1 count of fraud to avoid a potential death sentence in Ohio, accepting a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. His case exposed the horrifying ease with which a determined killer could exploit the inherent trust within the medical system. How many lives must be lost before we are forced to look past the white coat and see the shadow hiding behind it? Dr. Jack Kevorkian, a pathologist from Michigan, became one of the most controversial figures in modern medicine, earning the provocative nickname Dr. Death. Unlike the other figures on this list, Kevorkian's motive was not greed or malice, but a fervent ideological crusade. He was a passionate advocate for the right to die, believing that terminally ill patients in immense and incurable suffering should have the option of a physician-assisted suicide. In the 1990s, he acted on this belief, assisting in the deaths of more than 130 people, often using a device he built called the Mercitron. His actions placed him at the epicenter of a furious national debate on ethics, religion, and the law. To his supporters, he was a compassionate hero, a champion of individual liberty against an uncaring system. To his detractors, he was a rogue killer, playing God and violating the most sacred tenets of medicine. The law, however, was clear. Euthanasia was illegal. Kevorkian's crusade reached a dramatic climax in 1999 when he took a step further. He not only assisted in a death, but personally administered the lethal injection to a patient and sent the video to the television show 60 Minutes. It was a direct challenge to the legal system, an act of defiance he knew would lead to his arrest. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to up to 25 years in prison, of which he served around 8 before being released on parole. How do we judge a man who broke the law not for personal gain, but to force a moral question the world was afraid to answer? These doctors didn't just break the law, they shattered the fundamental principle of the doctor-patient relationship, the belief that you'll be helped, not harmed. Their crimes are not mere statistics. They are scars on the souls of thousands, victims, their families, and the fabric of a society that begins to doubt those it once trusted implicitly. These stories force us to confront the nature of evil that can hide behind the most respectable mask and the systemic failures that allow such tragedies to occur. How can we build a system where such betrayals become impossible? How do we restore trust when it's been so deeply undermined? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this video made you think, please like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell to stay updated on our new investigations.